In this video, we're going to engage one of the way that people in Greco-Roman antiquity wrote, specifically by hand. We are going to counter the claim that persons in antiquity did not often compose text in their own hand. This sort of myth or idea that writing was the domain of scribes and that the everyday person or any writer did not necessarily write in their hand, but rather they normally dictated. Rather, I'm going to argue from chapter 4 of my book, Gospel Media, that handwriting played an important role in the composition process of various kinds of texts, though how and why it was used varied on the basis of a text genre and the author's social context, literacy, and compositional practices. What we're going to do is look at what ancient people actually write, sometimes in their own hand, sometimes not in their own hand, in order to make the claim that people could and did often write in their own hands. We're going to first look at some letters from the Greco-Roman world, both from what we would call the literary elite, those sort of at the very top of the social ladder. And then we're going to look at letters from the everyday people of the Greco-Roman world before turning to see what some people say about how one writes literature specifically in this context. We begin with Cicero, who's writing to his friend Atticus and says, "I believe you have never before read a letter of mine, not in my own handwriting." You may gather from that how desperately busy I am. So Cicero is telling Atticus that the reason that the thing he is looking at, the reason that the letter he is looking at is not Cicero's handwriting, which Cicero presumes Atticus will recognize right away because he is so accustomed to looking at Cicero's own handwriting, is because Cicero is too busy. Cicero had written Atticus handwritten letters for years and years and years, and so it probably comes as somewhat of a surprise to Atticus that Cicero is not writing in his own hand. And after Cicero writes that last letter, after he dictates it, he doesn't write it in his own hand. We start to see after that more often Cicero not handwriting to Atticus. It becomes more common for him to dictate, but when he does, he normally makes some kind of excuse for why he is not writing in his own hand. So this one, he sort of jests or jokes, "You must not suppose it's out of laziness that I don't write in my own hand." But that's exactly what it is. He's saying, I'm too lazy. I don't want to handwrite right now. So I'm just going to dictate this letter. We see the same thing with two other members of the social elite in Greco-Roman antiquity, the famous sort of poetic or philosopher empire Marcus Aurelius and his tutor Fronto, who go back and forth very often indicating that they write to each other in their own hands. So this first letter up at the top of the slide, Fronto, the tutor, is writing to the emperor Marcus Aurelius, suggesting that he always write in his own hand because his tutor dotes on the characters of his handwriting. He really likes to look at his handwriting and see it. And we'll see that there's a very good reason for that in just a little bit. In another letter written from Fronto to Marcus, the next one down, Fronto indicates that he is not writing in his hand. And again, there's an excuse made. And in this case, the excuse is health. He has widespread pains in his shoulder and elbow and knee and ankle so that he can't write by hand. Marcus does something similar in this next letter down. He says he is in fact writing in his own hand, but Fronto can probably see that he is not entirely healthy or not entirely well because of the shakiness of his handwriting. And in the last letter there, Fronto says, "Please forgive me. Don't be offended that you don't have a letter in my handwriting, even though I wrote one, you wrote one to me in your own handwriting." And we see this sort of in a summary fashion also from the philosopher Seneca, who down at the bottom of this first letter here says that that which is sweetest when we meet face to face is afforded by the impress of a friend's hand upon his letter, recognition. So what Seneca is saying here is that when you see someone's handwriting, you get a sense that their whole person is sort of being presented to you. as being, it's almost like seeing them face to face. Not quite the same, not as good, but almost. And then Quintilian, again, in a summary way, says that writing in one's own hand is important in our studies. And then at the end here, at all times, in all places, and especially in confidential and familiar letters. That is, letters written to friends. One will find pleasure in not having neglected this skill, the skill of writing by hand. So from the letters of the literary elites, we get the sense that there's sort of an expectation that you write letters, personal letters, to your friends and family members in your own hand. And we see that played out sort of lower down the social ladder. We're going to see it played out in the Greco-Roman novels. So these are just like our novels today. These are sort of long, extended stories, and they are particularly romance novels. Very often in the romance novels, two people get married, husband and wife, and then they get separated from one another immediately. And this is what has happened in the novel Kallarhoe, also called Chairias and Kallarhoe, taken from the name of the two protagonists, Chairias the husband, Kallarhoe the wife. So the two are separated from one another. Kallarhoe has sort of been abducted by pirates and then bought by someone and been made that person's wife. And Chairias is going to write to her. He has a friend that advises. Once Chairias thought she was dead. Kallarhoe also thought Chairias was dead. Once Chairias learns she's alive, he has a friend that says, you should write her a letter. She'll know it's you. Her emotions will be sort of stirred up, and she'll want to find a way to get back to you if you could write her a letter. So Chairias takes his advice, but he's very, very emotional, and he wants to write, but he can't because his hand is trembling from his emotion. So the imagination of the author of the novel here is that the letter would of course be handwritten. It would not be dictated. One, so that Kallarhoe could recognize her husband's handwriting, but also again because the handwriting is the representation of the person. So if Chairias wants Kallarhoe to feel emotions from missing him, then the best way to do that would be to sort of represent himself with his own handwriting. And then later on in this same novel, after Chairias and Kallarhoe have gotten back together, things have worked out for them, Chairias writes back to the person that bought her and to whom she was married for a little while. And down at the bottom there, she says, I have written this in my own hand. So in this part of the novel, Kallarhoe is writing a letter, and the letter is actually embedded into the novel. It says, this is what the letter was, what it looked like, what it said. Kallarhoe indicates that she has written in her own hand. When Dionysius, who receives this letter, who is addressed at the beginning of it, when he receives it, he does not even need to see the part that says, I have written this to you in my own hand, because as soon as he sees it, he becomes emotional because he recognizes Kallarhoe's letters or handwriting. And he also recognizes that he is no longer going to be with her because she says Kallarhoe greets Dionysius, her benefactor, not her husband any longer. So he has this sort of fit of emotion as soon as he sees the letter because he recognizes Kallarhoe's handwriting. And once again, the imagination of the novelist is that persons wrote in their own hand when they wrote personal letters, even women. And similarly, a similar sort of case in another Greek Greco-Roman romance novel called Leucippe and Cleitophon. Leucippe is the wife, Cleitophon is the husband. They're separated from one another. Leucippe writes to Cleitophon, and Cleitophon sees Leucippe's writing right away and recognizes it. He recognizes her handwriting. Again, the imagination of the novelist is Leucippe writes in her own hand, and someone can immediately recognize someone's handwriting because that's the normal way that you write letters to friends and family. When we move into actual letters written from the ancient world, from the actual sort of everyday persons, where we have the content of the letter themselves, we see this preference for handwriting sort of trickle down to everyday persons. So in this letter, the sender is, we don't know what their name is because the top of the letter is, you can see up here is missing. It's gone altogether. And so these three dots here indicate indicate what is missing, what can't be reconstructed. So the name of the sender is missing, but we do know that he is sending the letter to a man named Isidoros, his brother, and he says, I received your letter through which I get the feeling of seeing you. So once again, this idea of recognition of a person's handwriting is a recognition of their person. So this letter writer has received a handwritten letter from Isidoros, and this letter is probably handwritten in and of itself. So if the normal convention is someone sends you a handwritten letter, you send one handwritten back, presuming you have the ability to write in your own hand, then that's probably the case with this particular letter. This letter here is my favorite papyri letter from the ancient world. It's from Apion to his father Epimachus. It's just an absolutely gorgeous letter. You can see, even if you don't read any Greek, you can see how beautiful and straight the handwriting is. Apion does not explicitly say that he writes this in his own hand, but that seems to be the implication based on what I have in bold here. So Apion says, I ask you, my father, to write me a letter about your health, about my siblings' health, and third, so that I can adore your handwriting. He says, I want to see you through the letter. So we get that sentiment again, that one sees a person through their own handwriting. And then he says, because you educated me well. So presuming that Apion is educated, and presuming that if he wants a letter handwritten from his father, he's probably going to send a handwritten letter. So most likely this letter is handwritten from Apion. And what's going on, what Apion says is, hey, I've joined the army. My travels have gone well, and I have a new name. So when a non-citizen joined the Roman army, they would take on a Roman name. And he says, my name is now Antonius Maximus, down at the bottom of the letter. And why this is important is because in this letter here, we have it written from Antonius Maximus, the same person, but with their name changed, and a number of years have passed. So Antonius Maximus, who is also Apion, but now goes by his Roman name, writes to his sister Sabine. And he doesn't say anything about writing in his own hand here, but if we look closely at the two letters and you sort of compare them, I'll go away for just a second here. You may pause and try and compare the letters. Again, even if you don't know Greek, you might be able to point out or notice the ways that some of the letters look very similar to one another, especially the ways that the letters sort of come over the side of the margin. Here, there's a tendency for Apion or Antonius Maximus to sort of fling his pen over this way. And you see that reflected in both of these letters, but there's also similarity at the individual letter level of letters. And so what's interesting about this is that we have Apion and Antonius Maximus writing two different letters to two different persons, but we have the same handwriting, indicating that this person was handwriting their letters, because the odds of dictating to the same scribe across several years, a gap of several years, is fairly unlikely. So we have Apion / Antonius Maximus writing two different letters in his own hand, and also saying that he appreciates seeing his father's handwriting. One more papyri letter here. This one is written from a young child. It's hard to know exactly how young he is, but you can see based on the handwriting itself, compared to Apion's handwriting, it's very, very blocky. Again, even if you don't know Greek, you can sort of see how the letters are formed with quite a bit of care. It's taking this person their time to write, and you can get the sense that they're forming the letters in a sort of really, really blocky way. But what's interesting about this letter is Theon is not happy with his father. He has sort of this petulant tone, which has made this letter a bit infamous. And he's upset that he didn't get to go to Alexandria. He didn't get to go to the big city with his dad on business. And he says, hey, if you don't take me next time, I'm not going to write you a letter. So again, we have that sentiment that a letter is a reflection of a person, that there's something valuable about a handwritten letter, that there's a sentiment attached to it. And this is what makes Theon's threat sort of, at least in his mind, credible. He knows that his father probably values a handwritten letter from his son, just as I value handwritten documents from my children. And so his threat is that I'm not going to handwrite you again if you don't take me to Alexandria. So again, this idea that there is a value attached to a handwritten letter. And this is from Palados. It's an anthology of sort of little poems, maxims, and proverbs. And we have reflected here this idea once more, not in letter form, but in sort of poetic maxim form. It says, nature, loving the duties of friendship, invented instruments by which absent friends can converse. Pens, paper, ink, handwriting, tokens of the heart that mourns afar off. So essentially this maxim is saying that one of the affordances, one of the benefits, or one of the things that letters offer is the fact of sort of seeing a person across time and space, even though you're not actually seeing them face to face. That pen, paper, ink, and especially handwriting are a reflection of the person themselves. And so this really shows up in those personal and familiar letters. But what we also see is that when it comes to literature itself, people handwrote in the process of composing literature. They handwrote at different points in the process. So I give us three different texts here. I'm going to go away to just make it a little bit bigger for you. First is the satirist Horace. He's giving advice, sort of writing advice, and he says, often you must flip your stylus to erase if you hope to write something worth a second reading. So Horace is imagining an author writing with their own hand and erasing things in order to make the writing good. And so Horace may have in mind one or both of these things. He may have in mind writing on a wax tablet. If you turn the stylus of the wax tablet around, there's a flat edge in which you can smooth out the wax and rewrite something. Or it could be that he has in mind sort of scratching off the ink from papyrus in a sort of similar manner. But in any case, he has in mind handwriting and editing as one handwrites. The next text is from Porphyry, from what's called the Life of Plotinus, a biography of a guy named Plotinus. And Porphyry tells us how Plotinus wrote. He says, in writing, he did not form the letters with any regard to appearance or divide his syllables correctly, and he paid no attention with spelling. He was wholly concerned with thought, and which surprised us all, he went on this way right up to the end. He worked out his train of thought from beginning to end in his own mind, and then he wrote it down. Since he had set it all in order in his mind, he wrote as continuously as if he were copying from a book. So Porphyry is saying that Plotinus doesn't really do what Horace suggests. He doesn't edit as he goes. He just does this sort of stream of consciousness thing where everything in his mind, he just writes down. So that the writing is sort of the medium, the visual expression of his thought, but Plotinus handwrites it all in one go, not caring about how it looks like and not caring about spelling. And then lastly here we have Marcus Aurelius writing a letter. He says that from 10:30 until the present time, I have been writing. So he's been doing literary writing and also have read a good deal of Cato. And I am now writing this to you with the same pen. So here, the idea is that Marcus is handwriting a letter, as was the preference, but he indicates the pen that he is handwriting his letter with, he was using earlier to handwrite literature, either taking notes or writing some kind of initial draft, so that there is the sense in which both letters and literature were handwriting was an important part of the process of composing both of those kinds of texts. And again, we return to Quintilian, who we talked about a little bit earlier, but he's sort of the great champion of handwriting all kinds of documents, literature and letters in the Greco-Roman world. He says, writing in one's own hand is important in our study and is the only way of ensuring real, deep-rooted progress. Slow writing delays thought, ill-formed or confused writing is unintelligible, and this produces a second laborious stage of dictating what needs to be copied out. So, at all times and in all places, and especially in those confidential and familiar letters, one will find pleasure in not having neglected this skill either. The sort of idea for Quintilian is that if you handwrite, you're going to make a better you're going to make a better product in the end, and the whole process is going to work out a whole lot better for you. So Quintilian's strong preference for creating drafts of literature and also for writing letters is to handwrite them. And so to gather some of our conclusions here about writing by hand, about not dictating to a scribe. First, handwriting was utilized for various kinds of texts. It is not the case that handwriting was the domain of scribes alone, that only scribes were able to handwrite various documents or able to be the ones who put pen to paper or stylus to wax when it came to creating literature, and especially personal letters. There's a strong preference that personal letters be handwritten. So this particular kind of document is going to be handwritten more often probably than other kinds of documents from the Greco-Roman world. It's important to remember that writing is a means of expressing thought. Writing itself is a medium in which thought is transferred into a visualized expression that can then be shared and experienced by a different person. And so as a means of expressing thought, writing is also editing. What writing does, in contrast to speaking, sort of an affordance or benefit of writing, is it slows down the way that we think and makes our thought a little bit more clear, because typically in writing, you are not present with the person who is reading your writing. So you need to make your writing clear in order that your thought can sort of be transferred to or connected to the person who is reading your thought. In a live context with speaking, when two people are co-present with each other, there can be clarification. So even if you don't speak entirely clearly, you can clarify what it is that you are saying. Writing, the reason that it's important to edit writing and the reason that writing slows us down is so that we can be a little bit more clear in our modes of expression. And so we've seen that handwriting letters especially was common, but the next most common sort of part or role that handwriting played was in creating notes and initial drafts, that when one is sort of making the notes for their literature or one is writing sort of the rough copies, the first drafts, this is where you would write out in your own hand, where an author would be the one writing rather than a scribe. And in contrast, handwriting final and additional copies was less common. We need to remember that in the ancient world, and especially the Greco-Roman world, slavery sort of underpinned so much of the culture, and slaves were essentially viewed as different kinds of technologies. So you would have many, many scribes who were enslaved, and they were enslaved for the purpose of being essentially copy machines, so that you might write your initial copy, your initial draft in your own hand, if you were a member of the literary elite, and then you would pass it on to a scribe and say, hey, make this into a clean copy, make this look a lot better. Or you would say, hey, I want you to make 3 copies for these 3 different friends so I can begin to circulate this text. Or your enslaved scribe may be the one who goes and gets a text from your friend and copies it down. So less common than handwriting for letters and initial drafts was handwriting subsequent and final copies of a text.